In the winter of 1889, 12-year-old Margaret Whitmore walked into her family's farmhouse in rural Ohio and made a request that would haunt 3 generations. She asked her parents to bury her alive. Not tomorrow, not next week, but that very evening. The strangest part? She knew exactly where, exactly how deep, and exactly what they would find when they dug her back up 3 days later. What happened next defied every law of nature and reason, leaving behind a mystery that turned a quiet farming community upside down and created a legend that still whispers through the Ohio countryside today. Margaret Whitmore lived with her parents, Thomas and Eleanor, on a 200-acre farm outside the small town of Millbrook, Ohio. The year 1889 had been particularly harsh. Crops failed across the county. Livestock died from a mysterious illness that veterinarians couldn't explain. 3 children in neighboring farms had vanished without a trace over the summer months. The Whitmore family, like everyone else, was struggling to make sense of a world that seemed to be falling apart around them. But Margaret was different from other children. She had always been different. Since she could walk, she would stare at empty corners of rooms and carry on conversations with people no one else could see. She knew things she shouldn't know. When Mrs. Henderson from the next farm over was going to have her baby. When the old oak tree by the creek would fall. When her father's prize bull would break its leg. Margaret would announce these things days, sometimes weeks, before they happened. And she was never wrong. The townspeople whispered about the Whitmore girl. Some said she was blessed with the sight. Others whispered darker things. But Thomas and Eleanor loved their daughter and protected her from the gossip and stares. They had learned to listen when Margaret spoke about things that hadn't happened yet. It had saved their lives more than once. On December 15th, 1889, Margaret came home from school acting stranger than usual. She sat at the kitchen table and drew pictures of coffins, dozens of them, all different sizes, all buried at different depths underground. When her mother asked what she was drawing, Margaret looked up with eyes that seemed far older than her 12 years. "I need you to bury me tonight, Mama. In the old cemetery behind the church, 6 feet down, just like the grown-ups. But you have to come back for me in 3 days. Not 2 days, not 4 days. Exactly 3 days." Eleanor Whitmore felt her blood turn to ice. "Margaret, darling, why would you say such a terrible thing?" "Because if you don't bury me, everyone in Millbrook is going to die. All of them. And it will be my fault." Margaret explained that she had been having dreams. The same dream every night for 2 weeks. In the dream, she saw a darkness coming to their town. Not a storm or a fire, but something much worse. Something hungry. Something that fed on the living and left nothing behind but empty shells that looked like people, but weren't people anymore. "It's coming for me first," Margaret said, her small hands trembling as she spoke. "But if I'm already buried, already dead, it can't take me. And if it can't take me, it can't use me to get to everyone else. The burial ground is protected. Sacred ground stops it from getting what it wants." Thomas Whitmore was a practical man. He farmed the land his grandfather had farmed. He went to church every Sunday and believed in God and hard work and the things he could see with his own eyes. But he also knew his daughter. He knew that when Margaret spoke about things that hadn't happened yet, those things always came to pass. "Margaret," he said carefully, "even if what you're saying is true, burial means dying. You understand that, don't you?" "No, Papa." "Not dying, hiding. The old woman in my dreams taught me how to do it. How to make my heart slow down until it almost stops. How to make my breathing so shallow that no one can tell I'm alive. She said it would feel like the deepest sleep I've ever had. But I have to be buried in the old cemetery. The ground there remembers all the prayers that have been said over it. It will keep me safe until the darkness passes." Margaret's parents tried to talk her out of it. They offered to leave town, to pack up everything and move west where whatever was coming couldn't find them. But Margaret shook her head. "It's not just coming for our family. It's coming for everyone. And I'm the only one who can stop it. But I have to be buried by midnight tonight, or it will be too late. As evening fell, strange things began happening around Millbrook. Dogs started howling in harmony, a sound that made people's skin crawl. Horses refused to leave their stalls. Cats disappeared entirely. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than an hour, and a fog rolled in from the east that was thick as wool and smelled like rotting flowers. Thomas and Eleanor made the hardest decision any parents could make. They prepared a simple pine coffin and loaded it onto their wagon. Margaret helped them, calmly giving instructions about how deep to dig, which direction her head should face, and how to mark the grave so they could find it again. At 11:30 that night, the Whitmore family stood in the old cemetery behind the Methodist church. Thomas had dug a proper grave, 6 feet deep, just as Margaret had requested. The fog was so thick now that they could barely see each other, even standing arm to arm. Margaret climbed into the coffin and lay down. She looked peaceful, almost relieved. "Remember," she said to her parents, 3 days. "Come back in exactly 3 days, and don't worry if I look different when you dig me up. The hiding changes you a little." Eleanor was sobbing, but she nodded. Thomas closed the coffin lid and began shoveling dirt over his living daughter. It was the most horrible thing he had ever done, but somehow he knew it was also the right thing. The next morning, 3 more children vanished from farms around Millbrook, but this time there were witnesses. Mrs. Patterson saw her 8-year-old son walking toward the woods behind their house at dawn. She called to him, but he didn't turn around. When she ran after him, she found his clothes in a neat pile at the edge of the tree line. Her son was gone, but something else was walking around in his shape. Something with his face and his voice, but eyes that were completely black. By the second day, half the town had been replaced by these hollow copies. They looked like the people they had been, but they moved wrong, smiled wrong. Their eyes reflected light like an animal's eyes. They gathered in groups and whispered in a language that hurt to hear. If you want to know what's really happening in your community, if you want to learn the signs that something like this might be coming to your town, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We're going to be covering more cases like this one, and the information might save your life. The real people who remained alive barricaded themselves in their homes and waited. They didn't know what they were waiting for, but they could feel that something was building toward a conclusion. The fog never lifted. The temperature never rose. And every night, more people walked out into the darkness and came back as something else. On the 3rd day, Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore returned to the cemetery. They brought shovels and lanterns and prayers. When they opened Margaret's coffin, what they found defied everything they thought they knew about life and death. Margaret was alive, but she was different. Her skin was pale as moonlight and cold as stone. Her hair had grown 3 inches and turned completely white. But most unsettling of all were her eyes. They glowed with a soft silver light, and when she looked at something, you got the feeling she was seeing much more than what was there. "Did I do good, Mama?" Margaret asked as her parents helped her out of the coffin. Her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "You did perfect, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, though she was terrified of what her daughter had become. Margaret stood up and brushed the dirt from her burial dress. Then she walked to the center of the cemetery and began speaking in a voice that carried much further than it should have. She spoke in that same language the hollow copies had been whispering, but when Margaret spoke it, the words felt like blessings instead of curses. All across Millbrook, the things wearing human faces began screaming. They clawed at their stolen skin as if trying to tear it off. One by one, they collapsed into piles of black dust that the wind scattered into nothing. When the sun rose the next morning, the real people were lying in the places where the copies had fallen, alive but unconscious, with no memory of the past 3 days. The darkness was gone. The fog lifted. The temperature returned to normal. Margaret had saved everyone, just as she said she would. But the price of her heroism was steep. Margaret was no longer entirely human. She could still love her parents and laugh at jokes and help with farm chores, but she also existed partially in some other realm. She would disappear for hours at a time and return with knowledge of things happening hundreds of miles away. She aged slowly, looking exactly the same at 16 as she had at 12. Most disturbing of all, Margaret began collecting the stories of other children like herself. Children who had been chosen by forces beyond human understanding to serve as guardians against things that should not exist. She filled notebook after notebook with their tales, creating a record of a hidden war that had been going on for centuries. The people of Millbrook never spoke publicly about what happened during those 3 days in December 1889. By unspoken agreement, they told outsiders that there had been a terrible flu outbreak, and many people had been too sick to remember much about that time. But privately, they watched over Margaret Whitmore with a mixture of gratitude and fear. Margaret lived with her parents until they died of old age. Then she lived alone in the farmhouse, tending a garden that grew plants no one had ever seen before, and receiving visitors who arrived in the middle of the night and left before dawn. Some of these visitors were human, others were not. In 1923, a young newspaper reporter named James Crawford came to Millbrook to investigate rumors of strange happenings. He managed to convince Margaret to tell him her story, and he published it in the Cleveland Plain Dealer under the headline, "The Girl Who Saved a Town." Most readers dismissed it as rural folklore, but the article caught the attention of people who knew better. Margaret told Crawford that what happened in Millbrook in 1889 was not unique. Similar incidents occurred every few decades in small towns across America, usually in places where the boundary between our world and darker realms had grown thin. Children like herself were born specifically to stand guard at these weak points, though most never learned to control their abilities the way she had. "The darkness is always hungry," Margaret explained to Crawford. "It looks for ways to break through and consume everything it touches. Most of the time, the barriers hold, but sometimes they crack, and something has to step into the gap. Usually that something is a child who was born different, born with one foot in each world." Crawford asked Margaret what advice she would give to parents who suspected their child might be experiencing supernatural phenomena. Her answer was both practical and chilling. Listen to them. Don't dismiss their fears or their visions as imagination. Children see things adults have trained themselves not to see. If your child tells you something bad is coming, believe them. If they ask you to do something that seems impossible or frightening, consider that they might know something you don't. Sometimes love means trusting your child to know their own destiny, even when that destiny terrifies you. Margaret Whitmore disappeared in 1924, exactly 35 years after her burial. Her neighbors found her house empty, but perfectly preserved, as if she had simply stepped out for a walk and forgotten to come back. No one ever saw her again, but people in Millbrook still report strange occurrences that suggest she might still be watching over the town. Children playing in the old cemetery sometimes see a young girl with white hair and glowing eyes standing among the tombstones. She never speaks to them, but she nods as if acknowledging their presence before fading away like morning mist. Dogs still refuse to enter certain parts of the woods behind the old Whitmore farm. And every December 15th, residents report seeing lights moving through the fog that rolls in from the east. But Margaret's story raises questions that no one has ever been able to answer. How did she know the exact ritual needed to hide from the darkness? Who was the old woman in her dreams who taught her these ancient secrets? And most importantly, are there other children like Margaret living among us right now, preparing for battles we can't even imagine? Because according to the notebooks Margaret left behind, what happened in Millbrook was just one small victory in a much larger war. A war that's still being fought in small towns and quiet neighborhoods across the world. And the next battle might be closer than you think.